The sinister story of the Appalachian butcher. Nobody knew where that meat came from. Before the Appalachian butcher. Quick comment. Where are you watching from right now? Virginia? Midnight somewhere. I read them all. Subscribe for the next dark tale. Let's go. The road into Grey Hollow wasn't on most maps. It wound through the Blue Ridge like a scar, narrow, unpaved, swallowed by pine trees so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground even in July. In winter, the mountain closed like a fist around the town, cutting it off from the rest of Virginia for weeks at a time. But the people of Grey Hollow didn't mind. They had everything they needed. They had Eli Harrow's butcher shop. The shop sat at the center of town, between the post office and the old Baptist church, its hand-painted sign weathered to near illegibility. Eli had run it since before most residents could remember. He was a tall man, thin in the way old trees are thin, not frail, but stripped down to something essential, something that had survived too many winters to be moved by anything ordinary. His hands were enormous. His eyes were the pale gray of fog over the mountain. He never spoke much, but he always had meat. "Finest cuts you'll ever taste," the locals would say, loading their paper-wrapped parcels into the backs of their trucks. Don't know how he does it. Don't need to. The children of Grey Hollow grew up eating Eli's stews, Eli's roasts, Eli's thick slabs of smoked meat that made the whole street smell like a church supper. Mothers swore by him. Fathers shook his enormous hand every Saturday morning and thanked him for keeping their families fed through the lean months. Nobody asked questions. It was just the way things were done in Grey Hollow. Thomas Weld arrived on a Tuesday in early November, when the first serious frost had turned the mountain roads to glass. He was 29, a junior reporter for the Roanoke Tribune, assigned to cover what his editor called a routine rural disappearance story. Probably just people moving on without telling anyone. 3 people had gone missing from Grey Hollow in the past 8 months. A retired schoolteacher, a young farmhand from out of town, a traveling salesman who had stopped to ask for directions and was never seen again. Thomas had driven 3 hours through fog and freezing rain to get there. He pulled up in front of the only diner in town, Mabel's, and ordered coffee and pie. The waitress, a red-haired woman in her 40s named Clara, set his cup down and studied him the way people in small towns study strangers, with calm, absolute attention. "You hear about the missing folks?" she asked. "Word gets around fast," Thomas said. "Word's all we got up here," she replied. "Eat your pie, then go home." Thomas smiled politely and took out his notebook. Outside the frost-covered window, across the street, he could see a light on in Eli Harrow's shop. A silhouette moved behind the glass. Slow, deliberate, carrying something heavy. Thomas watched it for a long time before he wrote his first note. The butcher never closes. The Grey Hollow sheriff was a man named Dale Pruitt, broad-shouldered, permanently sunburned, with the expression of someone who had made peace with things Thomas hadn't yet learned to accept. He met the reporter in his office the morning after Thomas arrived, poured him coffee from a pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the previous decade, and spread 3 manila folders across his desk. Ruth Campbell, 63, retired teacher, went to pick up a package from the post office on March 4th, never came home. He opened the second folder. Danny Ferris, 22, seasonal farmhand, hired by the Colton farm up the ridge, disappeared June 17th, left all his belongings in his bunk. He opened the third. Gerald Sykes, traveling salesman from Bristol, last seen at Mabel's diner on August 29th. His car was found 2 miles up the mountain road, engine still running. Thomas studied the photographs. All 3 looked ordinary. All 3 had simply ceased to exist, as cleanly as if Grey Hollow had absorbed them. "Any leads?" Thomas asked. Dale Pruitt closed the folders slowly. "Mountain takes people sometimes, always has." "That's your official statement?" The sheriff looked at him with those settled, peaceful eyes. That's the truth. Thomas spent 3 days knocking on doors. Most people wouldn't talk. Those who did said the same things in different words. The mountain was dangerous. Strangers should be careful. It had always been this way. But on the 3rd evening, sitting alone at the bar in Mabel's, an old man named Hector Good slid onto the stool beside him. Hector was 80-something, half-deaf, with hands that shook constantly and eyes that were, somehow, completely still. "You've been asking about the missing," Hector said, not as a question. "I have." "You been to the butcher yet?" Thomas looked at him. "Why would I go to the butcher?" Hector was quiet for a long time. He drank his beer. He stared at the bottles lined up behind the bar. Then he said very quietly, "Ruth Campbell hadn't bought meat from Eli in 2 months before she disappeared. Said the taste was different. Said it bothered her." "Different how?" Thomas asked. Hector stood up slowly, buttoned his coat, and placed a worn dollar bill on the bar. "Different like she knew what she was tasting," he said, "and she still couldn't stop eating it." He walked out into the cold without another word. Thomas sat very still for a very long time. Then he wrote in his notebook, "Visit the butcher tomorrow." He sat in his car outside Mabel's diner for almost an hour, the engine running for heat, staring at the frost that crept across the windshield from the edges inward, slowly narrowing his view of Grey Hollow to a small, clear circle. He thought about what the technician had said. He thought about how she hadn't said it. He thought about the parcel of meat he had bought from Eli Harrow's enormous, careful hands, wrapped in white paper, the way all things in that shop were wrapped, neatly, precisely, like gifts. He had been a reporter for 7 years. He had covered fires and floods and courtrooms and the ordinary catastrophes of ordinary lives. He thought he understood how people justified the things they did to survive. He was beginning to understand. He hadn't understood anything at all. Something kept him in Grey Hollow. The same instinct that had made him a good reporter in the first place. The story wasn't just Eli Harrow. It never had been. The story was the town. The story was the silence that 400 people had maintained for decades, the collective agreement to look at the glass cases full of neatly wrapped parcels and ask no questions, and say thank you and come back next Saturday. That kind of silence didn't happen by accident. He started paying attention differently, instead of asking direct questions, which had gotten him nowhere. He simply watched. He sat in Mabel's with a cup of coffee and his notebook closed, and he observed. He watched who came into the shop across the street and who came out. He watched how long they stayed. He watched the faces of people as they emerged onto the street, parcels under their arms, and he catalogued the expressions. Not guilt exactly, not shame exactly, but something between the two. A settled, weathered look, like a scar that had long since stopped hurting. He watched how the townspeople greeted Eli on the street. That was what told him the most. The warmth wasn't casual. It had a weight to it, an obligation pressed into every handshake and nod. The way you treat someone who has done something for you that you can never fully repay and can never fully forget. And can never fully bring yourself to examine too closely, because examining it means examining yourself. He found Margaret Colton on the 4th day. She was the wife of the farmer whose land Danny Ferris, the missing farmhand, had worked before he vanished in June. Her property sat 2 miles up a dirt track off the main road, a spread of frozen fields, and a farmhouse that had been old when her parents were young. She was hanging laundry in the cold when Thomas pulled up, working with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had long ago made peace with hard labor and harder weather. Thomas introduced himself. She looked at his press credentials without expression and went back to her laundry. "I'm looking into the disappearances," he said. "Danny Ferris worked here before he went missing." "He was a good worker," she said, without looking up. Shame he moved on. "Did he tell you he was leaving?" People don't always say goodbye. She pinned a sheet with practiced precision. Especially the young ones. They get restless. He left all his belongings behind, Thomas said. His clothes, his wallet, his truck. Margaret Colton's hands did not stop moving, but something changed in the rhythm of them, a barely perceptible hesitation, as if the machinery of her composure had caught on something and then forced itself back into motion. "Young men are careless," she said. Thomas watched her for a moment. Then, carefully, "Mrs. Colton, when did you last buy meat from Eli Harrow?" The hands stopped. Not for long, half a second, maybe less. But Thomas was watching for it, and he saw it. The mechanical calm cracked, and something showed through the crack. Not grief, not horror. Something far more complicated, and far more human than either. The expression of a person who has looked at something they cannot unsee and has spent years learning to look past it, building layer after layer of routine and necessity and love for their family over the top of it, like sediment over a buried thing. Then she picked up another sheet. "I buy from him every week," she said, "same as everyone." Thomas drove back down the dirt track in silence. He spent the rest of the day walking the town. Not interviewing, not knocking on doors, just walking, up and down the two streets that constituted Grey Hollow's center, past the post office and the Baptist church, and the hardware store, and the small library that appeared to be open only on Thursdays. He walked past Eli's shop 3 times. Each time, there were people inside. Each time, they came out with their parcels and their weathered, settled expressions and got in their trucks and drove away. He counted 17 customers in 4 hours. In a town of 400 people, on a Wednesday morning in November, in a place with no tourism and no passing traffic, Eli Harrow's butcher shop had 17 customers in 4 hours. The town needed him. It had always needed him. A need, Thomas was beginning to understand, was its own kind of chain. He found the Baptist church unlocked in the late afternoon, the way country churches in small towns are sometimes left unlocked. A gesture of openness that also says we have nothing to hide and we trust our neighbors, both of which Thomas was now inclined to read differently. He sat in a pew near the back and tried to put his thoughts in order. The missing people had no connection to each other, except geography. Except that they had all come to Grey Hollow and disappeared. Ruth Campbell, the retired teacher who had been born here, had lived here all her life, had started to notice something and stopped buying from Eli and had vanished in March. Danny Ferris, a stranger from out of town, disposable in the calculus of a place that closed ranks against outsiders. Gerald Sykes, a traveling salesman, the most disposable of all. A man whose absence would be explained away as a man who simply drove on. He thought about who chose the victims. He thought about how a town of 400 people kept a secret like this. He thought about children growing up eating Sunday dinners that their parents never examined too closely. He thought about the face of every person he had spoken to in Grey Hollow, and the face of every person who had refused to speak to him, and how, behind all of them, he could see the same thing if he looked hard enough. They were not monsters. That was what disturbed him most. Reverend Paul Gaines found him there, in the back pew, as the light outside turned the dirty amber of a mountain sunset. He was a slight man in his 60s, with a minister's practiced gentleness, and eyes that had clearly seen things gentleness couldn't fix. He sat down in the pew across the aisle from Thomas, without being invited, and folded his hands in his lap. "Clara told me there was a reporter sitting in the church," he said. "Small town," Thomas said. "Very," the Reverend agreed. They sat in silence for a moment. The last of the amber light moved across the wooden floor between them. "How long have you known?" Thomas asked. Reverend Gaines considered the question with the patience of a man who had been considering it for a very long time. "Suspected," he said carefully. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Suspicion you can live with, the Reverend said. Knowledge is harder. He paused. I took this parish 11 years ago. Came from Lynchburg. I didn't grow up here, didn't eat at Eli's table as a child, didn't have that first winter where there was nothing else. I came in from outside, and I could see what others couldn't see, or wouldn't. And you said nothing. Reverend Gaines looked at his folded hands. I counseled Eli privately, 3 times. He listened the way he listens to everything, quietly, completely, and without changing his mind. He paused again. And then I looked at my congregation. People I had baptized and buried and married and sat with through their worst nights. I looked at them, and I thought, what does the law do to all of them? What does this story do to their children? To Margaret Colton's grandchildren, who never chose anything? 3 people are dead, Thomas said. I know, the Reverend said. His voice didn't waver, but something behind his eyes moved, shifted, like something heavy adjusting its weight. I know that. I have known that. I will know that, until the day I die. He stood up slowly, the way old men stand, carefully, negotiating with gravity. I'm not asking you not to write your story, he said. I'm just telling you what the story actually is. It isn't about a monster in a butcher shop. He looked at Thomas steadily. It's about what people become when they're hungry enough, and how long that lasts after the hunger is gone. He walked to the front of the church, genuflected out of habit, and disappeared through a side door. Thomas sat alone in the darkening church for a long time. Outside, across the street, Eli Harrow's light was on. That evening, Hector Good found Thomas on the porch of the boarding house, the way Hector always seemed to find him, appearing out of the mountain dark without announcement, as if the old man had been waiting just out of sight for the right moment. He sat down heavily in the other porch chair and looked at the mountain for a long time without speaking. The pines moved in the wind. Somewhere below the ridge, a creek ran over stones with a sound like distant voices. You figured it out, Hector said. I'm starting to, Thomas replied. You talked to Margaret? Yes. And the Reverend? Yes. Hector nodded slowly, as if pieces were settling into place. Then you know that they know, he said. Not all of them know they know. Some of them have convinced themselves they don't know. The human mind is very gifted at that, at building walls around things. You live behind the wall long enough and you forget the wall is there. Why doesn't anyone say anything? Thomas asked. Not even anonymously, not even a phone call. Hector was quiet for a long time. You ever go hungry? He asked finally. Not diet hungry, not skip lunch hungry, really hungry. Children crying, cupboards bare, 3 days without a real meal hungry. Thomas said nothing. 1993, Hector said. Ice storm came down off the mountain in January, worst in 40 years, closed every road in and out of Grey Hollow for 11 days. 11 days. We had nothing. Stores had been low already. Supply truck hadn't come in a week before the storm. Families ran out of food on day 4. Day 5, people were melting snow for water. Day 7, there were children crying in houses all up and down this street. He paused. The wind moved through the pines. On day 8, Eli Harrow opened his doors. He continued. He had meat. How much meat? I still don't know. I don't want to know. He opened his doors and he fed everyone in this town. No charge, no questions. He walked from house to house himself, those big hands carrying parcels, knocking on every door. He sat with Margaret Colton's eldest boy while the child ate, and the color came back into his face. Thomas said nothing. You don't forget that, Hector said. You don't turn that man in. You don't look too hard at what he's doing, because looking too hard means admitting what you already know. And admitting that means admitting what you ate when your children were crying, and nobody can do that and stay whole. He looked at his shaking hands. And once you've eaten it, he said quietly, once you've been saved by it, you're part of it. Every single person in this town is part of it. You understand? It's not loyalty. It's not fear. It's something worse than both of those things. It's complicity that came wrapped in salvation. How long has this been going on? Thomas asked. His daddy ran the shop before him, Hector said, and his daddy's daddy before that. This mountain has been keeping Grey Hollow alive, and Grey Hollow has been keeping its mouth shut for a very long time. He stood up slowly and buttoned his coat with trembling fingers. Write what you need to write, he said. I'm not asking you not to. I'm just asking you to understand that there aren't any innocent people in this story. He paused, including me. He walked off the porch and into the dark without looking back. Thomas sat alone with the sound of the wind and the creek and the mountain pressing down on everything from all sides, and he opened his notebook, and for a long time he didn't write a single word. He sat at the small desk in his room at the boarding house, the single lamp casting long shadows across the walls, his notebook open to a page filled with fragments, names, dates, descriptions of expressions, half-formed questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The analysis results from the laboratory lay beside it, the single sheet of paper creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. He had read it until the words blurred, protein composition consistent with human tissue, mitochondrial DNA markers inconclusive without reference samples, muscle fiber structure indicative of recent post-mortem processing. He had covered death before, car wrecks on icy mountain roads, heart attacks in tobacco fields, the ordinary ways life ended in places like Grey Hollow. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was generational. This was a town that had looked at the unthinkable and called it survival, then called it tradition, then stopped calling it anything at all. He thought about the faces he had seen over the past week, Margaret Colton's half-second hesitation over the laundry line, Reverend Gaines's quiet certainty in the church pew, Hector Good's trembling hands and unflinching eyes. He thought about Clara at the diner, how she had set down his coffee that first day and told him to go home. He thought about the 17 customers he had counted going into Eli's shop on a Wednesday morning, each one emerging with a parcel and that same settled expression. He closed the notebook. He knew what he had to do. The sky was still black when he started driving, the mountain roads empty and treacherous with black ice that gleamed faintly under his headlights. He passed the Roanoke Tribune turnoff without slowing. He passed the state police barracks in Wytheville. He drove straight to the laboratory, arriving as the first techs were unlocking the front doors, their breath clouding in the cold. The technician who had run his analysis met him in the lobby. Her name was Dr. Laura Hensley. She was younger than he had expected, mid-30s, sharp-featured, with the tired eyes of someone who worked too many late nights identifying contaminants in milk and pesticides in well water. She led him to a small conference room without speaking and closed the door behind them. "You didn't hear this from me," she said, sliding another printout across the table. This one had additional annotations in her neat handwriting, cross-references to medical literature, diagrams of muscle tissue under magnification, chemical breakdowns he couldn't fully pass but could feel in his gut. "It's definitive?" Thomas asked. She nodded once. "As definitive as it gets without a court order and a full forensic panel. The fat content, the collagen breakdown pattern, the specific isotope ratios from the local water table, it all matches. It's not bear. It's not deer. It's not even dog." She paused, looking at him steadily. "It's us." Thomas felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when you've been awake too long, and your body reminds you it has limits. "How certain?" he asked. 98%, she said. "And I've spent the last 2 days trying to find the other 2%, and failing." She sat back in her chair, folding her arms. "What are you going to do with it?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. He drove back to Grey Hollow as the sun came up, painting the Blue Ridge in cold blues and greys. The town was waking, smoke rising from chimneys, trucks rumbling to life, the faint clatter of breakfast dishes behind curtained windows. He parked across from Eli Harrow's butcher shop and waited. Eli arrived at 5 a.m. on foot, as always, walking down the empty street with a measured stride that covered ground without haste. He unlocked the front door, flipped the sign to open, and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, lights came on inside. The silhouette moved behind the frosted glass, slow, deliberate, hanging cuts of meat in the display cases. Thomas crossed the street. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered. The shop was immaculate as always, white tile floors, scrubbed daily, glass cases gleaming under fluorescent lights, the air heavy with cold and the clean metallic tang of refrigeration. Eli emerged from the back room, wiping his enormous hands on a spotless cloth, his pale grey eyes settling on Thomas without surprise. "Back again," Eli said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Thomas said. Eli studied him for a long moment, his head tilted slightly as if measuring something invisible. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way you acknowledge a truth you've been expecting. "Figured you might," he said. He gestured to a stool behind the counter. "Coffee?" Thomas shook his head. He pulled the laboratory printout from his coat pocket and laid it on the glass counter between them. Eli glanced at it without touching it, then looked back at Thomas. "How long?" Thomas asked. Eli leaned against the counter, folding his arms. His forearms were corded with muscle and scarred from decades of sharp steel and hard work. "Long time," he said simply. "Granddaddy started it. 33, maybe 34. Depression hit these mountains harder than most places. No roads in, no roads out. People starving. He had a choice, watch them die or do what needed doing. And it never stopped. People kept coming," Eli said. "Mountain roads bring strangers. Hikers get lost. Salesmen run out of gas. Farmhands looking for work. City folks thinking they want the simple life." He shrugged slightly. "Winter comes. Roads close. Folks need to eat. Simple as that." "Ruth Campbell lived here her whole life," Thomas said. "She wasn't a stranger." Eli's expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in those pale eyes, not regret exactly, but recognition. "Ruth got curious," he said. "Started asking questions, tasting things, stopped coming to the shop. Folks noticed, talked. She went for a walk one morning and didn't come back." Danny Ferris. Kid from Florida, worked the Colton place 3 months, got restless, started talking about going home. One night he walked into the woods and kept walking. Gerald Sykes, salesman, Bristol plates, asked too many questions at Mabel's. Car ran off the road 2 miles up. Nobody found him before the cold took him. Eli paused. "I found him." Thomas felt a wave of nausea roll through him, not from the words but from the calm, the absolute unhurried certainty of a man explaining the weather. "You killed 3 people this year," Thomas said. Eli looked at him steadily. "I kept 40 families fed through 3 winters," he said. "Babies born, old folks making it through 1 more season, Christmases with full tables. You can write that down too." 40 families, Thomas repeated, who all knew, who all ate. Eli nodded once. "They know what they need to know. They come back every week. They shake my hand. They say thank you. That's consent enough for me." Thomas stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. "This ends," he said. "Today." Eli watched him go without moving. "Write what you need to write," he said to Thomas's back. "Mountain's been here longer than either of us." Thomas wrote everything down. He drove to Roanoke that afternoon. hands steady on the wheel, and filed the story with his editor over the phone first. Every detail, every name, every laboratory result. His editor listened without interrupting, then said 5 words. "Jesus Christ, Thomas. Confirm it." The state police moved fast. 6 days later, they rolled into Grey Hollow in unmarked vans. No sirens, no press, just quiet efficiency. They sealed off Eli Harrow's butcher shop and the property behind it. A cinder-block shed with 3 heavy freezers sunk into the concrete floor. They found what they expected to find, layer after layer of evidence going back 8 decades, bones meticulously cleaned and processed, tools sharpened to surgical precision, ledgers in a locked desk drawer recording deliveries, and customers served with the neatness of a man who believed in doing his work well. DNA from the freezers matched Ruth Campbell, Danny Ferris, Gerald Sykes, and at least 9 others going back to the 1970s. Older remains were too degraded for identification, but the volume spoke for itself. Eli Harrow was arrested without resistance. He walked to the police car in the weak December sun, handcuffs glinting on his wrists, the same unhurried stride he had always used. A crowd had gathered on the street, 400 people, silent, watching from porches and truck beds and the steps of the Baptist church. No one shouted, no one wept, no one turned away. As the car door closed behind him, Eli looked out at them. Really looked. Maybe for the first time in years. And something in his expression softened, not regret, not fear. Something almost gentle, like a man surveying a lifetime's work and finding it, against all reason, good. The story broke nationwide 3 days later. Roanoke Tribune got the exclusive, but CNN and Fox picked it up within hours. Reporters flooded the mountain roads. Satellite trucks parked nose to tail on the street outside Mabel's diner. The New York Times ran a 3-page spread on the sociology of rural survival cannibalism. Academics debated nature versus nurture on cable news. True crime podcasts scrambled to record emergency episodes. Thomas watched it all from Roanoke, 2 hours away, his phone ringing off the hook with interview requests he declined. His editor called him into her office a week after the arrests. She closed the door and poured them both coffee from the good pot she kept hidden in her filing cabinet. "You want the town's name in the follow-up?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about Margaret Colton hanging laundry in the cold, her hands stopping for that half-second before resuming. He thought about Reverend Gaines in the church pew, weighing souls he couldn't save. He thought about Hector Good on the porch, saying, once you've been saved by it, you can't uneat it. He thought about Clara at the diner, serving pie to strangers and telling them to go home. He thought about 100 Saturday mornings when fathers shook Eli's hand and mothers planned their week's meals and children grew up strong on meat that came from the mountain. "No," Thomas said finally. "Leave it out." His editor raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Smart. You'll destroy 400 lives that way. People who were hungry once. People who had children crying. People who never held the knife." "They ate," Thomas said. "They survived," she replied. Thomas never ate meat again. He kept the notebook from Grey Hollow locked in a drawer in his apartment. He kept the laboratory printout folded in his wallet. A talisman or a warning. He wasn't sure which. He took a leave of absence from the Tribune and drove west, away from the mountains, through the flatlands of Tennessee and Arkansas, until the air smelled different and the horizons opened up, and he could breathe without tasting iron. He thought the distance would fix him. It didn't. Months later, in early spring, he drove back to the Blue Ridge just once, not to Grey Hollow, but to the county road that led to it, parking half a mile from the turnoff where the pavement gave way to gravel. The mountain was green again, alive with dogwood and laurel, the same road that wasn't on most maps. The butcher shop was still there. A new sign hung above the door, hand-painted, fresh, in the same style as the old one. Harrow and Sons Meats. A pickup truck sat out front, unloading crates from the valley. Smoke rose from the chimney of the cinder block shed in back. Thomas sat in his car for a long time, watching. A woman came out of the shop, mid-40s, sturdy, with the same pale grey eyes as Eli. She paused on the steps, looked straight at his car half a mile away, and raised a hand in calm, unhurried greeting. Thomas didn't wave back. He put the car in reverse and drove away. And somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains, on a road that isn't on most maps, a small town sits in the shadow of the mountain. The butcher shop never closes. The meat is still very good. Nobody asks where it comes from. Nobody ever did. Nobody ever will. End.